Operation Focus ended the Six-Day War before it truly began. June 5, 1967. Before noon, the Egyptian Air Force, the largest and most prestigious in the Arab world, was no longer a functioning military instrument. Nearly 300 aircraft were destroyed on the ground. Runways were cratered. Command chains collapsed. Israel had achieved near total air superiority in a single morning. This result was not supposed to be possible. Israel was smaller, outnumbered, surrounded. Its entire air force committed to a single opening strike, leaving its own cities nearly undefended. So why did this work? Why did an operation that violated almost every conservative rule of air warfare succeed so completely? And why did the most dangerous part of Operation Focus have nothing to do with dogfights, missiles, or pilot skill? Because this was not a battle for the sky. It was a calculated attack on time, habit, and a fragile assumption buried deep inside modern military doctrine. What follows is not a story about bravery in the cockpit. It is an autopsy of a decision that should have collapsed under its own risk, and didn't. And the deeper we look, the more uncomfortable the logic becomes. Operation Focus was not designed to win a war. It was designed to make a war unwinnable for the other side. Israel's strategic problem in 1967 was brutally simple. It could not afford a prolonged conflict. It could not trade territory for time. And it could not survive a sustained air campaign against its cities, infrastructure, and mobilization centers. Any conventional opening move would favor its opponents. A defensive posture meant absorbing the first blow, something Israel's geography made intolerable. A limited strike risked escalation without decision. A phased campaign assumed time existed to adjust. It did not. So the question Israel faced was not how to fight well. It was whether a single, irreversible action could change the structure of the war itself. Operation Focus answered that question with a gamble. Not a gamble on superior pilots. Not a gamble on better aircraft. But a gamble on a fragile idea. That air power is only dangerous while it can take off. This is what makes Operation Focus fundamentally non-standard. It did not seek air superiority through attrition. It sought air denial through paralysis. Destroy the runways. Trap the aircraft. Collapse the sortie cycle. And the enemy's numerical advantage becomes irrelevant. But this logic carried a terrifying implication. If the assumption was wrong, if even a fraction of the enemy air force escaped, regrouped, and struck back, Israel would have no second chance. Every aircraft committed meant fewer defending home airspace. Every minute mattered. Every error would compound. Operation Focus was not a plan with flexibility. It was a plan with a single acceptable outcome. Victory. Immediately. And that raises the question that defines this entire analysis. Why would a rational command structure choose a strategy with no margin for recovery? To answer that, we need to step back, not to recount events, but to map the pressure that made conventional logic unusable in the first place. Because only when the constraints become visible does the unthinkable start to look inevitable. Operation Focus did not emerge from confidence. It emerged from constraint. By early 1967, Israel was strategically compressed. Geography offered no depth. Population centers, air bases, and mobilization hubs were tightly clustered. Any sustained air campaign against them would be existential, not tactical. Across its borders stood a coalition with numerical superiority. Egypt fielded the largest air force in the region. Syria and Jordan added additional vectors of pressure. Quantity alone did not guarantee coordination, but it guaranteed saturation. Israel's leadership understood something uncomfortable. Time favored the coalition, not Israel. A prolonged mobilization strained the economy. Extended reserve duty paralyzed civilian life. Every day without decision increased diplomatic pressure to de-escalate on unfavorable terms. There was no safe waiting posture. The air domain sharpened this imbalance. If Egyptian aircraft began flying regular strike missions, Israel would be forced into reactive defense. Runways would close. Repair crews would work under fire. Sortie rates would fall while the enemies remained intact. In that scenario, ground operations would become irrelevant. This is the first strategic boundary condition. Air superiority was not a preference, it was a prerequisite for national survival. But the situation was worse than it appeared. Egyptian doctrine emphasized centralized control. Aircraft were concentrated on major bases. Runways were long, exposed, and optimized for peacetime efficiency rather than wartime resilience. Dispersal was limited. Shelters were scarce. On paper, this was strength. In practice, it created dependency. Dependency on intact runways. Dependency on predictable command rhythms. Dependency on the assumption that the first strike would come later, or from someone else. That assumption mattered. Egyptian forces were on high alert politically, but not operationally aligned for an immediate air defense crisis. Morning routines persisted. Command cycles followed expectation, not contingency. Radar coverage existed, but interpretation depended on habit. Israel did not need invisibility. It needed normality. This is where the asymmetry deepened. Israel had spent years preparing pilots for low-altitude navigation, strict radio silence, and rapid turnaround. Not because it expected to fight that way indefinitely, but because it planned to fight that way once. Everything about the situation pointed toward a single conclusion. If Israel waited, it would fight on the enemy's terms. If it struck partially, it would invite retaliation without decision. If it committed fully, it might rewrite the structure of the conflict, or collapse instantly. This was not a choice between good and bad options. It was a choice between bad options and one catastrophic gamble. And inside that gamble sat a paradox. The more Israel concentrated its force, the more vulnerable it became. But the more decisive the result could be. The map of the situation did not suggest creativity. It demanded it. Because within these constraints, conventional solutions did not merely fail. They never truly existed. And it was precisely here, inside these tightening boundaries, that an option began to appear that no standard doctrine could justify. Military doctrine existed to prevent exactly what Operation Focus attempted. By the mid-20th century, orthodox air doctrine emphasized balance. Preserve defensive coverage. Maintain reserves. Escalate in phases. Never commit your entire air force at once. This logic was not cowardice. It was risk management. Air power was understood as inherently fragile. Aircraft could not be replaced quickly. Pilots were irreplaceable in wartime. Runways, fuel depots, command nodes, all were vulnerable. So doctrine preached dispersion, redundancy, depth, and above all, options. A normal opening campaign would have looked like this. Limited strikes. Gradual probing. Defensive counter-air patrols. Protection of domestic airspace. Incremental escalation while waiting for diplomatic pressure to shape outcomes. This approach maximized survivability. It minimized catastrophic failure. It also assumed something Israel did not have: time. If Israel followed doctrine, three consequences were almost guaranteed. First, initiative would be lost. Egypt's air force would dictate tempo simply by flying. Even limited sorties would force Israel into constant defensive readiness. Second, attrition would favor the coalition. Every intercepted raid still consumed fuel, maintenance hours, pilot endurance. The larger force could absorb losses. Israel could not. Third, and most dangerous, legitimacy would shift. The longer Israel waited, the harder it became to justify decisive action. A delayed strike would look retaliatory only in hindsight, not in perception. Doctrine assumed wars unfolded gradually. This war would not. There was another doctrinal assumption that mattered even more. Air superiority was supposed to be earned through combat in the air. Aircraft versus aircraft. Pilots versus pilots. Operation Focus rejected that premise entirely. It treated dogfights as a failure condition. If Israeli pilots were forced into sustained air combat, the plan had already broken. This inversion was radical. Instead of asking, "How do we defeat their air force?" the planners asked, "How do we prevent their air force from existing as a system?" Doctrine did not teach this because doctrine is built for repeatability. Operation Focus was not repeatable. It was tailored. Context-specific. dependent on habits, infrastructure, and assumptions that could vanish once exposed. That is why no conservative commander would choose it. Because doctrine exists to protect commanders from decisions that end careers or nations when assumptions fail. And yet, in this situation, doctrine itself became a trap. Following it guaranteed a slow defeat. Breaking it offered a narrow path to decisive control. This is the moment where Operation Focus stopped being a tactical option and became a philosophical rejection. Not of air power, but of how air power was supposed to be used. The planners were not smarter than doctrine. They were trapped by conditions doctrine was never meant to handle. And when that happens, the unthinkable stops being reckless. It becomes the only remaining lever. But recognizing that lever was only the beginning. The real danger lay in deciding whether to pull it, and who would bear the responsibility if it snapped back. Operation Focus did not appear as a finished idea. It emerged as a narrowing of options. Inside Israel's command structure, the debate was not abstract. It was operational and personal. Every proposal carried an implicit question: what happens when this goes wrong? A limited strike was discussed and dismissed. It would reveal intent without delivering paralysis. A defensive posture was evaluated and rejected. It ceded tempo and invited cumulative damage. A phased campaign was modeled and found incompatible with geography and reserve mobilization. What remained was not boldness. It was desperation refined into structure. The core proposal rested on a small set of assumptions. Not many, because each additional assumption increased fragility. The first assumption was brutal. That the enemy's air power existed primarily on the ground. Not symbolically. Physically. Aircraft concentrated on exposed runways. Maintenance cycles aligned to peacetime rhythm. Command authority centralized enough to delay reaction. If those conditions held, the system could be frozen in place. The second assumption was even riskier. That speed could replace defense. Every aircraft sent forward reduced homeland coverage. The planners accepted this vulnerability deliberately. They were not blind to it. They judged it survivable if the strike worked immediately. The third assumption was psychological. That normal patterns would persist until they were violently broken. That routine would override suspicion. That warning signs would be interpreted as noise. This was not arrogance. It was pattern analysis. Years of observation suggested that readiness existed on paper, not in execution. Alert states were declared. But behavior lagged. Operation Focus aimed to exploit that lag. Internal opposition was real. The risk was asymmetric. Failure would not merely cost aircraft, it would erase deterrence. No fallback plan could compensate. This is the part history often simplifies. The decision was not unanimous enthusiasm. It was controlled acceptance of existential risk. The planners were not convinced they were right. They were convinced that every alternative was worse. Operation Focus was approved not because it was elegant, but because it aligned with a single, unforgiving conclusion. If Israel could not control the first hours of the war, it would not control any of the hours that followed. And so the decision crystallized. Not as a leap of faith, but as a wager placed under full awareness of the stakes. What followed would test not courage, but systems. Not ideology, but logistics. Not theory, but execution under intolerant conditions. Because once the order was given, there would be no adjustments. Only motion. And the moment planning ended, the true enemy appeared, not the opposing air force, but the narrow margin in which reality still matched assumption. Operation Focus only existed on paper as long as reality cooperated. Once aircraft left the runway, the strategy ceased to be an idea. It became a chain of irreversible actions, each one dependent on timing, coordination, and silence. The execution phase was built around a single operational principle. Tempo would replace resilience. Israeli aircraft did not fly toward their targets at optimal altitude. They flew low. So low that radar coverage thinned. So low that fuel margins narrowed and navigation errors became lethal. This choice was not about stealth in the cinematic sense. It was about staying inside the enemy's reaction delay. Every minute gained before detection increased the chance that runways would be struck before aircraft could disperse. But this flight profile created a new vulnerability. Low altitude eliminated margin. Bird strikes. Mechanical failure. Navigation error. Any of these would not simply cost a pilot. They would alert the system. And alerting the system early would collapse the entire logic of the strike. The targets were not aircraft first. They were runways. This ordering mattered. Cratering runways required precision. The damage had to be deep enough to deny rapid repair. Shallow damage was failure disguised as success. Only after the runways were neutralized did the attack pivot toward parked aircraft. This sequencing compressed time even further. Aircraft had to strike, assess damage, re-attack if necessary, and leave. All before the enemy could reorganize command and response. Then came the most fragile component of the entire operation. The turnaround. Israeli airbases transformed into production lines. Aircraft landed, refueled, rearmed, inspected, and relaunched in minutes. Not as an achievement. As a necessity. If turnaround slipped, sortie density collapsed. If sortie density collapsed, the paralysis window closed. If that window closed, surviving enemy aircraft would take off. This is where Operation Focus was closest to failure. Ground crews worked at a pace that left no redundancy. A misstep meant catastrophe. A jammed munition rack. A fueling delay. A damaged tire. There was no buffer. The plan assumed perfection not because planners believed in it, but because the strategy offered no alternative. Microcrises occurred. Small delays. Minor damage. Moments where aircraft returned with less fuel than planned. Each one was absorbed only because the system as a whole was still ahead of the enemy's comprehension. This is the rarely discussed truth. Operation Focus did not succeed because nothing went wrong. It succeeded because nothing went wrong fast enough to matter. The execution phase reveals the true nature of the strategy. It was not a clever strike. It was an industrial process pushed beyond safety margins. Victory depended on maintaining speed longer than the enemy could adapt. And adaptation was inevitable. Which leads to the next question. When signals finally reached the opposing command structures, what did they see? And more importantly, what did they misunderstand? The first signals did not arrive as a single warning. They arrived as fragments. Radar anomalies. Interrupted communications. Reports that contradicted one another. None of them, on their own, demanded immediate escalation. This is the central failure point. The opposing command structure did not initially perceive Operation Focus as a coherent attack. It perceived noise. Aircraft detected briefly at low altitude. Runway damage reported without context. Explosions at bases assumed to be limited raids. Each data point was explainable within existing expectations. And expectations matter more than raw information. Egyptian air doctrine emphasized centralized authorization. Local commanders did not scramble aircraft without confirmation. Confirmation required clarity. Clarity lagged. This delay was not incompetence. It was structure. By the time patterns began to emerge, the system was already compromised. Runways were cratered. Aircraft were trapped. Command centers were struggling to reconcile incompatible reports. Some bases attempted emergency dispersal. Others waited for instructions that never arrived in time. A few launched aircraft, too few, too late, without coordination. This is the paradox Operation Focus exploited. The more centralized the command system, the more it resists reacting to partial information. Centralization creates efficiency in stable conditions. It creates paralysis in discontinuity. Israeli planners understood this. They did not rely on total surprise. They relied on delayed coherence. The enemy did not need to be blind. It needed to be uncertain for long enough. And uncertainty compounds. As bases went offline, communication lines degraded. As communication degraded, decision authority bottlenecked. As authority bottlenecked, local initiative froze. Even accurate reports lost value because they arrived too late to alter outcomes. This is where many narratives simplify the story. They describe an enemy caught sleeping. That is inaccurate. The enemy was awake. It simply could not assemble meaning quickly enough to act. And when action finally occurred, it was misaligned. Fighter patrols launched without clear targets. Air defenses activated against threats that had already passed. Commands were issued based on yesterday's assumptions. Operation Focus did not trick the enemy into doing nothing. It forced the enemy into doing the wrong things at the wrong time. This distinction matters because it reveals a deeper lesson. Modern military systems do not fail because they lack information. They fail because they cannot synchronize interpretation under stress. By the time synchronization began to recover, the decisive phase had passed. Air superiority was no longer contested. It was assumed. The enemy still possessed aircraft, but no longer possessed a functioning air force. Which leads to the unavoidable reckoning. If the outcome was so decisive, what was the cost of achieving it? And what would failure have looked like? By the end of the first day, the war had already tilted beyond recovery. Airfields lay cratered. Aircraft that survived the initial strike sat immobilized, useless without intact runways. Command networks were fragmented. Air superiority was no longer a contest, it was a condition. On the surface, Operation Focus delivered exactly what it promised. The coalition's numerical advantage evaporated before it could be exercised. Israeli ground forces moved under an uncontested sky. Maneuver replaced attrition. Speed replaced caution. But this is where analysis must slow down. Because decisive outcomes often hide disproportionate costs. The most visible price was human. Pilots flew repeated low-altitude missions with shrinking margins. Fatigue accumulated. Errors became more likely with every sortie. Survival depended not on bravery, but on sustained concentration under conditions where a single lapse meant death. Less visible, but equally real, was the psychological cost carried by the command structure. Operation Focus offered no emotional relief. There was no moment of confirmation until it was already too late to reverse course. If the strike had failed partially, if even a fraction of the enemy air force had escaped, Israel would have faced retaliatory bombing with diminished defenses. Cities would have been exposed. Airbases damaged. Mobilization disrupted. The planners knew this. They accepted a scenario where defeat would not be gradual. It would be immediate. There was also a political cost. Preemptive success hardened narratives. Victory simplified perception. But it also entrenched long-term instability. Operation Focus demonstrated that air power could be neutralized on the ground. The response was predictable. Shelters. Dispersal. Redundancy. Layered air defense systems. The strategic environment transformed. Future wars would not reward the same approach. The window that made Operation Focus viable closed almost as soon as it was exposed. This is the paradox of decisive strategy. The more effective it is, the faster it erases the conditions that allowed it to work. And finally, there is the moral cost, often avoided in tactical analysis. Operation Focus was clean only in retrospect. In real time, it was an irreversible act of escalation. Once initiated, there was no proportional response available. Only dominance or disaster. This matters because it reframes the operation. It was not simply a triumph of planning. It was a calculated acceptance of existential risk. Victory justified the decision. But justification is not the same as validation. The deeper question remains. Was Operation Focus an expression of timeless strategic insight? Or a singular alignment of assumptions that history allowed only once? To answer that, we must step away from the event itself and examine what this operation actually teaches, and what it dangerously tempts others to misunderstand. Operation Focus is often remembered as a lesson in surprise. That interpretation is comfortable and incomplete. Surprise was a mechanism, not the principle. At its core, Operation Focus was a strategy about system collapse. It did not defeat an air force in combat. It disabled the conditions that allowed an air force to function. runways, turnaround cycles, command authorization, interpretive delay. Each of these elements, on its own, is survivable. Together, they form a fragile chain. Operation Focus targeted that chain with precision. This is the first strategic insight, and the most misunderstood. Power does not reside in assets. It resides in processes. Egypt possessed aircraft, pilots, bases, radar. What it lost was synchronization. The second insight is more unsettling. Operation Focus succeeded not because the planners were certain, but because they were willing to act under uncertainty. This was not optimization. It was risk compression. Instead of spreading risk across time and phases, Israel concentrated it into a single opening window. This goes against most strategic teaching. Doctrine prefers controllable loss. Operation Focus accepted uncontrollable loss if the assumptions failed. Which leads to the third insight. This strategy only works in environments where infrastructure is centralized, command systems are rigid, reaction depends on confirmation, habit overrides anomaly. Once those conditions disappear, the strategy collapses. That is why Operation Focus is not a template. It is a diagnostic tool. It shows what happens when a military system is optimized for stability, not discontinuity. And this is where misinterpretation becomes dangerous. Many later planners took the wrong lesson. They copied the shape of the operation. Preemption, concentration, speed. Without understanding the fragility it exploited. Operation Focus does not argue that boldness wins wars. It argues that systems fail at their seams. And seams are contextual. The final lesson is the hardest to accept. Operation Focus was not a repeatable victory condition. It was a one-time convergence of geography, doctrine, psychology, and time. Its brilliance lies not in how it was executed, but in recognizing that the window existed at all, and in accepting that if the window closed mid-action, there would be no explanation powerful enough to undo the damage. This is why Operation Focus remains controversial. Not because it was unethical, not because it was reckless, but because it reveals an uncomfortable truth about modern warfare. Sometimes, the most decisive strategies are the ones that should almost never be attempted. They work precisely because no one expects a rational actor to choose them. And once they succeed, they ensure that no one ever gets to try again. Operation Focus did not win the Six-Day War by force alone. It won by collapsing a system faster than that system could recognize it was under attack. It is tempting to frame this as genius. It is more accurate to call it a controlled descent into irreversible risk. The planners did not eliminate uncertainty. They weaponized it. They understood that modern militaries do not fail when they lack strength. They fail when their assumptions are shattered faster than their structures can adapt. This is not a comforting lesson. And it should not be. Because it suggests that under the right conditions, the most dangerous move in war is not escalation. It is commitment. A commitment so total that once made, there is no safe way back.